The sun over Dustwater didn't shine. It glared. The sky was the color of dry bone, and the air shimmered with heat that made even the buzzards lazy. A single wagon rolled down the main street, creaking under the weight of supplies and judgmental eyes. Folks at the saloon door turned to watch as the missionaries stepped down, their coats powdered with red dust. They brought something, or rather, someone, with them. A woman. Her name, they said, was Mara. She was wrapped in a gray wool shawl, her face covered by a rough piece of sackcloth that hung from her hat like a curtain. Only her hands showed, dark from the desert sun, scarred by fire or work, no one could tell. A whisper rippled through the onlookers like wind through dry grass. "An Apache," someone muttered. "Too ugly to marry," another snorted. No one dared step closer. The woman stood still, as if she'd been carved from the same stone that built the town. Then he came. Elias Wren, a man known more by rumor than by sight. Broad shoulders under a faded duster, hat low over his eyes, beard peppered with gray. They said he lived up on Verde Mountain, where even the coyotes didn't bother howling. Folks called him the man who talks to the wind. He didn't talk much to people. He stepped down from his horse and nodded once to the missionaries. "You got the papers?" The preacher fumbled with a worn envelope. "As agreed, Mr. Wren. You'll supply the church with grain through the winter, and in exchange, you take the girl into your household." Elias didn't answer. His gaze lingered on Mara, not with disgust, but with a strange, unreadable calm. Dust swirled around them, soft and slow. The world seemed to hold its breath. The preacher crossed himself and muttered something about mercy. The townsfolk just stared, waiting for Elias to refuse. But he didn't. He signed the paper. Mara's eyes flickered beneath the shadow of the sack. If she felt fear, she hid it well. She climbed into Elias's wagon without a word. The crowd parted, whispering like snakes. As the horses pulled away, the preacher called after them. "She's quiet, Mr. Wren. Obedient. Grateful for a roof." Elias didn't turn around. "I'm not looking for gratitude." The wagon rolled out of Dustwater, leaving behind the last speck of civilization. The road wound upward into the Sierra Verde, where pine trees replaced sand, and the wind carried the faint smell of snow. Mara sat motionless, the coarse fabric brushing her lips, each breath tasting like dust and fear. From the corner of his eye, Elias watched her. He'd seen plenty of broken people before, men after war, women after hunger. But there was something different about this one, something he couldn't name. By the time they reached the foothills, twilight had turned the sky copper red. The trail grew narrow, the silence between them thicker. At last, Elias spoke, his voice low, like gravel sliding down a canyon. "You can keep the sack on, if that's what you need. I don't ask questions." Mara didn't reply. Her hands tightened on her lap. He looked ahead again, toward the peaks that swallowed the last light of day. "But up here," he added quietly, "the wind doesn't care who's ugly or not." The wagon creaked on through the pines. Behind them, Dustwater faded into darkness, a town that had traded away a woman to fill its grain stores. Ahead, the mountains waited, cold and indifferent. Elias's ranch sat high in the Verde Range, where pine trees whispered and snow came early. The land stretched wild and uneven, hemmed in by cliffs that caught the morning sun in streaks of silver. It wasn't the kind of place built for company. The wind sang louder than any voice, and the mountains kept their secrets well. By the time the wagon reached the cabin, twilight had already dropped its shadow across the yard. The horses steamed, breath rising like ghosts. Elias climbed down first and unlatched the gate. He didn't offer a hand to help Mara. She didn't ask for one. The woman moved like smoke, quiet, deliberate, and hard to hold on to. The cabin was plain but solid, built from pine logs Elias had cut himself years back. A narrow barn leaned beside it, half buried in drifts of snow from the last storm. The scent of wood smoke and horse sweat filled the air. Elias motioned toward the porch. "You'll find the kitchen to the right," he said, voice low and dry as sand. "Upstairs is mine. You stay on the ground floor. You eat, you work. I don't ask about your past. You don't ask about mine." Mara nodded once, the sackcloth veil still hiding her face. She carried her small bundle inside without a sound. That night, the wind came down from the ridge like a living thing, howling against the windows. Elias sat by the stove, mending a bridle strap, while the sound of her footsteps drifted soft and careful across the floorboards. She moved like someone afraid of waking the dead. Later, long after the fire had died down, Elias stepped out to check the horses. The barn door creaked open, spilling a thin light from a lantern hanging inside. He paused. Mara was there. She sat on a stool beside the gray mare, shoulders trembling under her shawl. Her hands were pressed to her face, and though she didn't make a sound, he could see her shoulders rise and fall, the kind of shaking that came from deep down, a sorrow too old for tears. Elias didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, his breath frosting in the cold. He wasn't a man who knew what to say to crying women, or to anyone, really. But something about the way she hid her face, even when she thought she was alone, twisted something in his chest. The mare snorted softly and leaned toward her, as if to comfort her. Mara reached up, stroked the animal's muzzle, and whispered something in Apache, a word the wind carried off before Elias could catch it. He turned back toward the house, boots crunching in the snow. Inside, he sat again by the stove, staring into the embers. The quiet of the place pressed against him, heavier than ever. For years, that mountain had been his refuge, a fortress of solitude. But now, with that silent woman sleeping beneath his roof, the silence didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like something alive, listening. Outside, the horses stirred. The wind moaned through the pines, and from the barn came the faintest sound, a whisper of song, raw and fragile, sung in a language he didn't know. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be, but it carried the kind of ache that even the mountain seemed to understand. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the dark window. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. But he couldn't tell if that was a comfort or a curse. Up on Verde Mountain, where winter came hard and early, a quiet began to settle between two strangers, one too proud to ask questions, the other too broken to speak. And in that silence, something unspoken began to stir, like the faint heartbeat of a story not yet told. Morning came pale and cold, a thin mist crawling down the slopes of Verde Mountain. The world smelled of pine, frost, and smoke from the kitchen stove. Mara was already outside before dawn, her shawl drawn tight, the rough sackcloth still covering her face. She worked like someone who'd been born to labor. Every motion was measured, steady, and silent. She shoveled the stables, hauled buckets of water from the creek, and split wood with hands that didn't seem to tire. When Elias stepped out with his coffee mug, he found her knee-deep in snowmelt, scrubbing the feed trough with an old brush. "Leave it," he called out. "You'll freeze your fingers clean off." She didn't answer, just kept working, sleeves rolled up, wrists trembling in the cold. Elias almost went to help, but stopped himself. He wasn't sure if she'd welcome it or see it as pity. By mid-morning, the ranch hands from Dustwater rode in, their laughter echoing across the yard. They'd come for a load of hay and whiskey talk, full of swagger and dust. When they spotted Mara near the barn, one of them, Clay Dorsey, a mouthy cowpoke with too much liquor in his blood, spat into the dirt. "Look there," he jeered. "The sack lady's out again." The others snickered. "Don't stare too long, Clay. Might catch something." Elias's jaw tightened. "You boys came for hay, not entertainment?" he said evenly. Clay smirked. "Just making conversation, boss. Ain't every day a man marries a ghost." The laughter died when Elias's eyes met his. The rancher didn't raise his voice or his hand. He didn't have to. His silence was heavier than any threat. When the riders left, the yard fell quiet again. Mara stood by the fence, her hands still on the gate. The sack hid her face, but Elias could tell she'd heard every word. That afternoon, he went out to check the gray mare, a mean-tempered animal that had thrown every man who'd tried to saddle her. But when he rounded the corner of the barn, he froze. Mara was there, standing beside the horse with a handful of grain. The mare's ears twitched, nostrils flaring, but she didn't bolt. Mara murmured something soft in Apache, her tone low and rhythmic, like a prayer whispered to the earth. The wind shifted, carrying her voice, melancholy and raw, the sound of a canyon echoing after rain. It wasn't a song meant for anyone to hear, yet it filled the whole yard. Elias stood in the doorway, motionless. The horse that had nearly killed him last spring now leaned its head against her shoulder like a child seeking comfort. He had no idea what she was saying, but he felt it all the same. Grief, endurance, and something older than either of them. When the song ended, Mara turned slightly, sensing she wasn't alone. Elias looked away before she could catch his gaze. He busied himself with the water pump, pretending he hadn't seen a damn thing. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of that voice, wild and wounded, haunted him long after the fire went out. He'd taken her in thinking she'd be another mouth to feed, another task checked off the ledger of his lonely life. But now he wasn't so sure. The woman under that sack wasn't a burden or a shadow. She was something else, something that didn't fit into his quiet, controlled world. Elias had spent years believing the mountain was the only thing that could understand his silence. Now, for the first time, he wondered if it was listening to hers instead. Outside, the wind swept through the trees, carrying that same faint melody he'd heard by the barn, an Apache tune, half sorrow, half prayer. And somewhere deep inside, the man who'd stopped believing in anything began to feel the ache of faith again. The storm came without warning. By nightfall, the sky above Verde Mountain had turned black and heavy, the kind of dark that swallowed sound. Rain slammed against the cabin roof, wind howled through the chimneys, and thunder rolled across the ridge like gunfire echoing in a canyon. Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the stove, boots still on, watching the flames dance inside the iron belly of the firebox. Every few minutes, the wind shook the windows so hard it rattled the dishes. That was when he heard it, faint at first, drifting down from the loft like a ghost's breath. A woman's voice. Mara's. She was talking in her sleep. Words broken and half-whispered, her tone trembling like the wind through pine needles. Elias rose quietly, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Taka." "Mother," she murmured in Apache, her voice raw and pleading. Then again, louder, "Taka, don't run!" Elias froze. The sound twisted through him in a way he couldn't name. There was fear in it. Loss. The kind that carved a scar deeper than skin. When he reached the stairs, she was thrashing in her bed, still trapped somewhere inside her dream. He hesitated, not knowing what to do, until her body went still again, breathing shallow, sweat glistening on her brow beneath the edge of the sack. He let her be. Some ghosts, he thought, don't want saving. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world gray and soaked. Elias was already out mending a fence when Mara came to the porch, her shawl clutched tight. She didn't speak, didn't meet his eyes. The wet air made her voice muffled under the sack. "Did I speak last night?" she asked quietly. Elias nodded. "You said some names." She stiffened. "I don't remember." He studied her for a moment, rain dripping off his hat brim. "Taka, that one meant something, didn't it?" Mara's hands clenched the fabric of her shawl. Her voice trembled, barely audible. "Lua le het roa, ka ho kamat toi." Then, in English, "The fire took it all, my people, my face." The words fell like ash between them. Elias didn't push her. He just stood there, the rain pattering soft around them, the silence heavier than any sermon. But later that day, while he worked the field, her words stuck to him like burrs. The fire took it all. That night, after she'd gone to bed, he sat alone and pieced the story together the way a man pieces broken glass. 3 years back, he remembered hearing talk in Dustwater about a cavalry raid on an Apache camp near the San Pedro Valley. They'd said it was justice, that the soldiers burned the place to the ground to make an example. No one spoke of the women and children who died in the smoke. Now, he understood. She hadn't just survived a fire. She'd survived them. The missionaries must have found her afterward, scarred, half dead, stripped of her name, and dressed her wounds with holy words before selling her future to a stranger up in the hills. Elias stared into the fire, jaw tight. The thought made his stomach twist. He'd fought in wars. He knew what men could do when they stopped seeing others as people. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine resin. He thought of her hands, gentle on the gray mare's muzzle, of her song, the one that made even wild animals go still. A fire like that didn't just burn flesh. It burned trust, faith, the right to belong anywhere. And yet, here she was, breathing the same mountain air, walking the same soil, still working from dawn till dusk, as if life hadn't already taken everything. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the flames painting his face in orange light. Somewhere deep in his chest, something old and quiet began to stir. A feeling he'd buried long ago beneath work and silence. He didn't know what it was yet. But as the fire hissed in the stove and the rain faded into mist, he knew one thing for certain. Mara wasn't the only one haunted by things that refused to die. Morning crept slow over the ridge, painting the lake below Elias's ranch in soft gold. Mist still clung to the water, curling over the surface like smoke from a dying fire. Elias was walking the fence line, checking for breaks where the storm had ripped through, when he caught sight of her. Mara stood by the edge of the lake, knees bent slightly as she filled a bucket. The air was still, so still he could hear the faint slosh of water against wood and the distant caw of a crow waking in the pines. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her shawl hung loose around her shoulders, and for once, the sack that usually covered her face had slipped, just enough for sunlight to touch her skin. Elias froze. A long, silvery scar ran from her collarbone up along her neck, disappearing under the fabric. Another faint mark curved across one cheek, not deep, but jagged, like lightning frozen in flesh. Her skin beneath it was the warm color of sandstone, sun-browned and strong. She leaned closer to the lake, and for a heartbeat, he saw her reflection. Not the sack lady the town mocked, but a woman carved by survival. The sight hit him with a quiet force he didn't expect. Not pity, not shock, just a deep, human ache. Elias turned away before she could sense him watching. He walked back toward the cabin, boots crunching over frozen soil. That image burned into his mind like a brand. All morning, he worked harder than usual, splitting wood, hauling feed, fixing a stubborn hinge, anything to drown out the thought of her standing there, the scars catching the dawn light. But every time he paused, it returned. The strength in her posture, the peace in her stillness, the way she'd survived fire and somehow kept a softness in her hands. That evening, when the cold settled deep and the sun dipped behind the ridge, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He cooked. He pulled down an old recipe from memory, his mother's herb stew, the kind she made on nights when the world outside felt too heavy. The smell of sage, wild onion, and venison filled the cabin. Mara lingered near the doorway, uncertain, her hands folded before her. The lamplight caught the edge of her veil, turning it to gold. "Sit," Elias said simply. She hesitated, then moved towards the table. He set a bowl in front of her, steam curling upward, warm and earthy. For a long moment, she didn't touch it. Then, slowly, she lifted her spoon and took a bite. Elias watched without staring, his hands resting on the table. "It's good," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. It might have been the first thing she'd said to him since that night of the storm. "My mother used to make it," he replied. Said it could mend anything except a stubborn heart. Something flickered behind the fabric that hid her face. Maybe a smile, maybe not. But she ate. Not fast, not desperate, just steady. They didn't talk after that. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low hum of the wind outside. Yet the silence between them felt different tonight. It wasn't the cold, hollow kind that filled a room after loss. It was warm, alive. When she finished, she set her spoon down carefully and whispered, "Thank you." Elias nodded. "You're welcome." It was such a small thing, a meal, a word, a moment, but in that smallness, something shifted. The cabin that had once been only wood, smoke, and emptiness now breathed like a living thing. The wind outside softened, brushing the window as if in blessing. Elias leaned back, eyes drifting to the flicker of firelight on the wall. He'd brought her here as part of a bargain. But somewhere between the scar on her cheek and the sound of her quiet gratitude, the bargain had turned into something else. Something he couldn't yet name. Up on the mountain, winter pressed close around them. But for the first time in a long while, the cold didn't reach the inside of the house. The first snow came heavy and hard, rolling down from the peaks like a white curtain drawn over the world. By morning, the trail down to Dustwater was gone, buried beneath 6 feet of drift. The wind howled through the pines, shaking the cabin until it creaked like an old ship at sea. Elias knew what that meant. They were trapped, for weeks, maybe longer. The fire in the stove burned steady, but the cold found its way into everything, through cracks in the logs, through boots left too close to the door, through silence itself. Days blended together. Elias split wood and checked the roof. Mara cooked, tended the horses, mended what she could. They spoke little at first, their words few but careful. Yet slowly, something began to thaw between them. Something small and human, buried deep beneath the snow. It started one afternoon when Elias found her studying a piece of paper by the window. His mother's old Bible lay open beside it. Mara traced the letters with her finger, brow furrowed under the sack. "You read English?" Elias asked. "Little," she said, her accent soft, the word stretched like a thread. He pulled up a chair. "Then we'll start with that." From then on, every night by the fire, Elias showed her letters. He wrote them in charcoal on scraps of paper, A, B, C, and she copied them with care. Her handwriting was uneven, but her focus never broke. In return, she taught him words in Apache. "Doya," she said one night, pointing to the sound of snow tapping against the window. "It means rain." He repeated it, his voice awkward around the foreign syllables. She added, pressing her hand to her chest. "It means me." "She," Elias echoed quietly, hand resting over his heart. She looked at him for a long time, eyes unreadable behind the shadow of the lamp. For the first time, he thought he heard something close to a laugh. Small, fragile, but real. The days turned into weeks. The storm never stopped. Some nights the wind roared so hard it sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. Then came the night the barn roof gave way. Elias heard the crash through the storm and ran outside before thinking. The snow blinded him. The cold cut into his lungs. He made it halfway to the barn when the second beam snapped. The next thing he knew, the world went white, then black. When he opened his eyes again, he was pinned under timber, breath shallow, snow melting against his cheek. The wind screamed overhead, drowning every sound except one, her voice. "Elias!" Through the blur, he saw her, Mara, bareheaded, no sack, hair whipping wild in the storm. She was pulling at the beam with both hands, her arms trembling but steady, her face streaked with snow and ash. "Leave it," he gasped. "You'll freeze." She ignored him, braced her body, and pushed with everything she had. The beam shifted just enough for him to crawl out. She grabbed his arm, half dragging him through the drifts toward the cabin, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Inside, the oil lamp flickered low. Mara knelt beside him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. She met his gaze, eyes dark and alive. In that dim light, Elias saw something he hadn't seen since his wife died years ago. Fire, not from rage or survival, but from compassion, the kind that burned warm instead of cruel. Her hand brushed his cheek, and for a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the cabin, the air had changed. It wasn't just warmth from the fire. It was the quiet pulse of something unspoken, fragile as the snow falling beyond the glass. Elias lay back, breathing slow. Mara sat beside him, silent, the lamp's glow soft against her scarred skin. And as the wind howled through the mountains, Elias realized, some storms destroy everything in their path. Others bring two souls together just to prove the world can still be kind. Morning broke over Verde Mountain like a whisper. The storm had passed, leaving the world white and still. Sunlight filtered through the pines, catching on the icicles that hung from the cabin roof. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear, a deep, endless blue that seemed almost too bright after so much gray. Inside, the fire was burning low. Elias stirred the embers, his hands rough and blistered from the night before. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way she had dragged him through the snow, bareheaded, fearless, her breath coming out in clouds. Mara moved quietly behind him, laying out fresh logs by the stove. She wore the same shawl, but something about her was different. Lighter, maybe. The way she moved, the stillness in her steps. It carried a kind of calm that hadn't been there before. When she turned toward him, Elias noticed the sack was gone. At first he thought maybe she'd forgotten, but then he saw her face. She stood there in the morning light, shoulders straight, her chin lifted just enough to defy the world that had tried to break her. The scars caught the sun like tiny threads of silver, one tracing the line of her jaw, another curling near her temple. But her eyes were clear as a mountain spring after thaw. Elias felt something inside him stop. He didn't speak right away. Words felt too small for what he was seeing. The woman who'd hidden from the world for so long was standing bare before it, before him, and there was no shame in her anymore. Only quiet strength. She met his gaze steadily. "It's better this way," she said softly. "No more hiding." He set the poker down, his voice barely above a whisper. "People said you were ugly, Mara." Her breath caught for half a second. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I think they just never looked close enough. You're beautiful in the way that scares people, because you survived." The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Mara didn't move. Then, slowly, the tension in her shoulders broke, and she began to cry. Not the silent, buried kind, but the kind that came from somewhere deep, where pain and relief tangled together. Elias didn't hesitate. He reached out, his calloused hand brushing against her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, trembling slightly. For a heartbeat, he feared she might vanish, like smoke in the wind. But she stayed. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving only the soft creak of the pines. Inside, the world seemed to pause. Two souls breathing the same air, their silence saying more than words ever could. After a long moment, Mara whispered, "No one has ever said that to me before." Elias's hand lingered, his thumb tracing the edge of the scar. "Then it's long overdue." Her tears glistened in the morning light, catching against the burn marks that once made her hide. Now they shimmered like rivers cutting through the desert. They stayed like that for a while. No fire crackling, no clock ticking, just the soft rhythm of breath and the faint sigh of snow sliding from the roof. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter from the world. It felt like the beginning of one. When Mara finally stepped back, she didn't reach for the sack. She left it folded on the chair by the door, where the sunlight could find it. Elias glanced at it once, then looked back at her. "Let it stay there," he said quietly. "It's done its part." She nodded, a small, unsteady smile tugging at her lips, and as the day rose higher over Verde Mountain, the man who once spoke only to the wind found himself standing beside a woman who'd survived fire. And somehow, against all odds, both had begun to thaw. By the time spring crept back over Verde Mountain, the snow had melted into long ribbons of water that shimmered under the sun. Life returned in small, quiet ways. The horses pawing through thawing mud, the steady hum of bees near the shed, the smell of wet pine and smoke. For Elias and Mara, the cabin had begun to feel almost like peace. But peace, in Dustwater, was something folks didn't trust. Rumors rode faster than horses down there. It started with a drunk at the saloon saying Elias Wren had gone loco, living up on the mountain with a witch. By the next week, the talk had turned meaner. Whispers of an Apache woman casting spells, bewitching a man until he forgot his own kind. And then came the night the riders saddled up. 5 of them, all drunk, all angry, the kind of men who mistook cruelty for courage. They climbed the trail under a pale moon, rifles slung loose, laughter carrying on the wind. Mara heard them first. She was in the barn, brushing down the mare, when the sound of hooves echoed through the valley. It wasn't the rhythm of travelers. It was the restless clatter of men looking for trouble. She stepped outside, her breath catching in the cold air. The night smelled of whiskey and danger. Elias came out from the cabin, shotgun in hand, eyes narrow. "Stay inside," he told her, but she didn't move. "They came for me," she said softly. "If I hide, they win." Elias looked at her then, the woman who'd once covered her face from the world, now standing tall in the moonlight, her scars catching silver. He didn't argue. The riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, their torches swinging. The leader, a broad man with a red scarf and mean eyes, spurred forward. "Ren!" he shouted. "We're here to save you from whatever devil she's got you tangled with." Elias didn't flinch. "Go home, Cole." "Can't do that," Cole sneered. "Town says the Apache's bewitched you. Says she's got the devil's mark." He turned his horse toward Mara. "Take that ragged woman off your land, and we'll forget this ever happened." Mara stood her ground, hands trembling slightly as she lifted Elias's old rifle. The barrel gleamed under the torchlight. "Leave," she said. Her voice shook, but her aim didn't. Cole laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "You think I'm scared of a squaw with a gun?" Elias stepped forward, his shotgun pointed down, his voice calm as the mountain wind. "You take one more step," he said, "and you'll have to see your own soul staring back at you in her eyes." For a moment, no one moved. The wind died, and the only sound was the nervous shifting of horses. Cole's smirk faltered. There was something in the way Elias said it. Not a threat, but a truth. The torches flickered. One of the men muttered, "Let's go, Cole. This ain't right." Another turned his horse, then another. Within moments, the sound of hooves faded down the trail, swallowed by the forest. Elias lowered his gun. Mara did the same, her arms trembling now that it was over. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the crackle of the torches dying in the dirt. Elias looked at her and gave a slow nod. "You did fine." She let out a shaky breath, lowering her head. "I was scared." He smiled faintly. "So was I." Above them, the wind picked up again, rushing through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of anger. It whistled across the roof, not in warning this time, but in triumph. The town had sent its storm, and the mountain had sent it back empty-handed. Mara stood on the porch, watching the moonlight spill across the valley. For the first time, she realized something that almost made her smile. Dustwater could keep its fear. Up here, she had found something stronger, and the wind, slipping gentle through the trees, seemed to hum its agreement. A rough, wild hymn of victory only the mountains could sing. By the time spring settled over Verde Mountain, the snow had finally given up its grip. The streams ran fast and clear again, the kind of water that could wake the bones of the earth. Patches of green broke through the soil, stubborn as hope. The air smelled of pine sap and new beginnings. Elias rose early each morning to rebuild the barn. The old one, broken by winter and storm, had given way like his solitude. Now he worked slow and steady, hands raw from the hammer, sweat cutting trails through the dust on his neck. The rhythmic sound of wood meeting wood carried across the clearing, mixing with bird song and the faint hum of life returning. Down by the creek, Mara worked her own kind of miracle. The earth was soft beneath her bare feet as she planted rows of Apache corn, the seeds small but sacred. She moved with quiet reverence, murmuring words in her native tongue as she dropped each kernel into the soil. Elias paused from his work sometimes, leaning on his hammer to watch her. Her shawl fluttered in the warm breeze, and her hair, dark, streaked with copper from the sun, caught the light like a flame reborn. There was something peaceful about her now, something untamed, yet deeply grounded. The woman who had once hidden behind sackcloth now met the world head-on, eyes open, unafraid. That afternoon, as Elias was sweeping sawdust from the porch, he saw something hanging from the beam above the doorway. It was the sack, the same rough piece of fabric that had once been her prison. Only now it was clean, washed pale by river water and sunlight. Folded neatly, it hung like a relic from another life. He turned when he heard her steps behind him. Mara stood in the doorway, her face uncovered, skin kissed golden by the sun. "You left this out here," he said quietly. She nodded. "I washed it this morning." He looked at it, then at her. "You planning to keep it?" Her gaze followed his. "No," she said simply. "I don't need it anymore." She walked past him to the porch railing, resting her hands on the smooth wood. The valley below stretched wide and green, the mountains painted in soft, purple light. "This mountain," she said, "it's seen me for what I am. It doesn't turn away." Elias stepped beside her, the warmth of the setting sun brushing against his face. They stood there together, the world around them humming with life, frogs croaking from the creek, the rustle of young corn, the wind combing through the pines. Neither spoke for a long while. There was no need to. Some silences, Elias had learned, weren't born from distance. They were born from peace. The sky deepened to amber, then to rose. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the wind without effort. Mara's fingers brushed against Elias's hand on the railing, not a gesture of uncertainty, but of quiet understanding. He turned his head slightly, catching her reflection in the window beside them. Not the scars, not the wounds, but the woman she'd become. Whole. Elias let out a slow breath. "You know," he said, voice low and steady, "I reckon the mountain didn't just see you. It's been waiting for you." She smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe it's been waiting for both of us." The last light of day bled across the peaks, painting the sky in fire and gold. The air cooled, the world held still. Up on Verde Mountain, where once there had been only silence and ghosts, there was now something different, something alive. They didn't hold hands. They didn't need to. The land itself seemed to speak for them, its quiet song drifting through the dusk. And as the sun sank behind the ridges, Elias Wren and Mara stood side by side, the wind whispering between them like a prayer that had finally been answered. Years passed like river water through the valley. Quiet, steady, unstoppable. Seasons came and went on Verde Mountain, each one leaving its mark on the land and on the two souls who had chosen to call it home. The cabin grew older, the wood darkened with time, and the fields where Mara once planted Apache corn turned gold every summer before fading into frost. The world beyond the mountain moved on. Railroads cut through valleys, towns rose and fell. But up there, life kept its own rhythm. Elias and Mara stayed. They didn't leave for Dustwater again, not once. Folks down in town stopped expecting them to. They became something like a story, a whisper traded across saloon counters and campfires. "Old Wren's still up there," they'd say. "Lives with that Apache woman. Been years now." Some say she bewitched him. Others, with quieter voices, said, "No, maybe she saved him." On the mountain, they paid no mind to talk. Their days were simple: mending fences, feeding horses, tending the corn, sharing meals by the fire. It wasn't grand or easy, but it was theirs. When winter came, Elias would stack extra wood by the door, knowing the storms would hit hard. Mara would make her herbal broth, the same one that had kept them warm through their first blizzard together. At night, she still sang in Apache, soft, low, and full of memory. Sometimes Elias joined her, his voice rough, carrying no words at all, just a sound, deep and steady, like the earth beneath their feet. He aged the way mountains do, slowly, with dignity. His hair turned silver, his hands grew stiff, but his eyes stayed the same steady blue that had once frightened men off his porch. Mara's scars faded with time, softened by years of sunlight and peace. Yet her spirit, wild, untamed, never dulled. Then one winter, the first snow came early. Elias had been mending the gate when his chest tightened. He leaned against the post, breath short, eyes turned toward the ridge. The snow fell light as feathers. Mara found him there, the hammer still in his hand, the wind catching in his beard. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap, whispering his name over and over like a prayer. He looked up at her and smiled, the same quiet, gentle smile that had once told a frightened woman she didn't need to hide anymore. His last words came out like breath on glass. "Looks like the first snow." And then, just as softly, he was gone. That night, the wind howled through the valley, but it didn't sound mournful. It sounded like a song. Mara buried him at dawn beneath the pines overlooking the creek, where the water never froze, even in the coldest months. She stayed one more winter, living in the cabin they'd built together. Then, one morning, when the thaw came and the mist lifted from the valley, the cabin door stood open, the fire long burned out. Mara was gone. Some said she walked back into the woods of her people. Others claimed they'd seen her riding the ridge at sunset, her hair unbound, her face turned toward the wind. But the old-timers in Dustwater, they tell it different. They say that every year, when the first snow starts to fall on Verde Mountain, you can see two figures coming down from the high pass. A man and a woman leading a pair of horses side by side. The woman wears no veil, her face lifted to the sky. The man walks beside her, his hat tipped low, his hand brushing hers as they move through the drifts. They call her the Mountain Bride, the woman the world once mocked, but who made a man kneel not out of pity, but out of love. And they say the wind still carries their song, part English, part Apache, drifting down into the valley like a promise kept. That even in the roughest country, love can find a way to survive the fire and live on in the snow